The mud was thick enough to swallow a wagon wheel whole, but it was the bitter cruelty in the driver's voice that truly dragged her under. I am not ruining my horses for the likes of you. Giant, the man shouted over the torrential rain, tossing a worn canvas travel bag into the muck with a wet, heavy thud. Matilda stood in the freezing downpour, her massive frame trembling, not from the bitter cold, but from the sharp, familiar sting of rejection. But the truth of her journey was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay until the end of this memory with me, and if you have a moment, like and comment where you are watching from to see how far this story travels. Because sometimes, the heaviest burdens a person carries are the ones we cannot entirely see. She was a towering woman, built like the very rugged mountain she had traveled so desperately to reach. Beneath her soaked, solid red dress, heavy muscles coiled in her thighs, her biceps, and her broad shoulders. It was the physical legacy of a childhood spent as a literal beast of burden in a rigid, loveless city orphanage. For years, she had been tasked with hauling coal, chopping cordwood, and carrying iron stoves, while the other girls were taught to sew and sing. She had fled that iron-gated prison, seeking a place where she might finally be valued for the gentle warmth in her heart, rather than the immense, intimidating power resting in her bones. Yet, standing completely abandoned at the edge of this remote, unfamiliar mountain town, she felt exactly like the unlovable, cumbersome monster the city matrons always claimed she was. The stagecoach lurched forward with a violent crack of the whip, leaving deep, muddy ruts in the road as it disappeared rapidly into the gray, unforgiving curtain of the storm. From the deeply shadowed doorway of a solitary grist mill, Thaddeus watched the entire humiliating spectacle unfold. He was a colossal man himself, a weathered pillar of silent strength, wrapped in a damp ranch jacket and a battered leather cowboy hat. His exceptionally broad shoulders filled the wooden doorframe, his powerful, towering frame forged by years of hauling raw timber and hoisting heavy grain sacks. His sharp, observant brown eyes tracked the stagecoach as it fled the valley, then settled deeply upon the solitary, towering woman left behind in the deluge. He lived a fiercely reclusive life. He ground the town's grain, he accepted their modest coins, and he kept the rest of the world securely at arm's length. Since the brutal, unforgiving winter fever took his young family a decade ago, he had firmly locked the doors to his heart, burying his grief beneath endless hours of backbreaking labor. Yet, as he watched the rain batter the woman's shoulders, he found he could not turn away from the sight of her. Matilda bent down slowly, her chunky leather boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing, slick mud. Her large, scarred hands that possessed the terrifying strength to lift a heavy cast-iron stove without a sliver of assistance, gently retrieved her muddied canvas bag. She brushed the wet, messy blonde hair from her resolute face, maintaining a quiet, unbreakable dignity, even as the sky wept violently upon her. She did not cry. She had long ago learned that tears offered no shelter. Heavy, measured footsteps splashed through the gathering puddles behind her. Matilda turned sharply, her heavy muscles tensing on pure, defensive instinct. Thaddeus stood before her, a mountain of a man blocking the path of the storm. The relentless rain hammered against his thick, dark beard and the wide brim of his hat, but he did not flinch. More importantly, he did not look at her with the wide-eyed fear or the cruel, mocking disdain she was so heavily accustomed to enduring from men. He merely looked at her, his gaze remarkably steady, grounding, and unexpectedly safe. "The town is 3 miles out," he murmured, his deep, resonant voice rolling like distant thunder over the noise of the storm. "You will not make it before dark. The river is rising fast." Matilda swallowed the hard, painful lump forming in her throat, holding her soaked bag tightly against her broad chest. "I do not require charity, sir. I am far stronger than I look." "I can see exactly how strong you are," honest Thaddeus countered softly, tilting the brim of his hat just enough to shield his eyes from the driving rain. "But strength cannot stop a flash flood. My mill is dry." He did not offer his hand to her. He understood implicitly that a wild, cornered creature needed space, not sudden, forward movements. He simply turned his massive back to her, and began walking toward the looming, dark silhouette of the gristmill. He did not look back to see if she was following his path. He trusted that she would find the sense to step out of the rain. The interior of the mill was a sudden, quiet sanctuary of rough-hewn timber and the deep, earthy scent of crushed wheat. Thaddeus led her past the massive, silent grinding stones and pushed open a heavy oak door, revealing a modest, shadowy kitchen. A stone fireplace sat cold and completely dormant against the far wall. The wooden shelves were practically bare, reflecting the stark, hollow life of a man who viewed sustenance merely as essential fuel, utterly devoid of joy, comfort, or flavor. "You may dry yourself here," Thaddeus instructed, his tone low and strictly emotionally restrained. He moved toward a wooden storage bin in the corner, his thick, calloused hands retrieving a heavy woolen blanket. He set it upon a sturdy wooden table in the center of the room. Matilda stood awkwardly just inside the doorway, her towering, wildly muscular body dripping freezing water onto the dry floorboards. She felt entirely out of place, a massive, cumbersome imposition in this silent, solitary man's fortress. "I have no coin to pay you for the shelter tonight," she breathed softly, her voice carrying the rough, fragile edge of absolute exhaustion. Thaddeus paused at the threshold. His observant gaze drifted down to her scarred, trembling hands, then moved slowly upward to the weary stoop of her broad, powerful shoulders. He understood that specific, heavy exhaustion perfectly. It was the exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from carrying the immense crushing weight of the world entirely alone. "The door locks from the inside," he stated flatly, deliberately ignoring her remark about money. He reached into a nearby wooden barrel, effortlessly lifting a heavy burlap sack of raw, coarse flour. He carried it over and set it upon the table beside the folded blanket, followed by a small tin of salt and a heavy clay jug of fresh well water. "I take my coffee at dawn. Do not leave before then." With that final instruction, the towering mountain man stepped out of the kitchen, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The distinct, metallic click of the iron latch echoed in the small, quiet room, leaving Matilda entirely alone in the comforting shadows of the mill. She looked down at the rough woolen blanket, recognizing it as a rare, silent gesture of protection that she had never truly known in her harsh, unforgiving life. Then, her eyes drifted to the sack of raw flour, resting patiently on the worn wooden table. She reached out, her thick fingers brushing gently against the coarse fabric of the burlap. A deep, familiar warmth began to stir in her chest, a quiet, powerful instinct born from the only true kindness she had ever experienced in the city orphanage. The gentle lessons of an old cook who taught her that flour and water were not just food, but a language of love. She was a giant, a runaway, a woman treated as a beast by the world. But her massive sip knew the sacred rhythm of the harvest. Upstairs in his sparse quarters, Thaddeus lay awake in the dark, listening to the relentless pounding of the rain against the wooden roof, completely unaware of the profound emotional shift that had just crossed the threshold into his reclusive world. He had left her with a simple sack of raw flour and a cold, empty hearth, offering nothing more than temporary physical refuge from a bitter storm. But what would the silent, deeply grieving miller find when he pushed open that kitchen door the next morning? The fire crackled, casting a warm, golden glow against the rough-hewn timber walls. Matilda stood over the worn wooden table, her towering, wildly muscular frame moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She had not slept. She did not require sleep, when the familiar, comforting call of the harvest was entirely at her fingertips. The sack of coarse flour Thaddeus had left behind was no longer a mere provision. It was a blank canvas. She required no wooden spoons, no iron scales, and absolutely no measuring cups. Such precise, rigid tools belonged to a world that demanded strict conformity, a world that had always punished her for taking up too much space. Instead, she relied entirely upon the quiet, infallible wisdom of her scarred hands. Her massive, exceptionally developed shoulders rolled smoothly under the damp fabric of her red dress as she pressed her weight into the dough. The heavy exposed muscles of her biceps flexed and released with every downward thrust. Kneading was a task of immense physical endurance, but to Matilda, it was a profound act of devotion. She felt the exact hydration of the mixture through her thick fingers, adjusting the salt and the well water purely by the texture, resisting her palms. It was a silent conversation between the earth and her soul. She poured her gratitude, her unspoken sorrow, and her desperate hope for belonging directly into the yielding mass. With every powerful fold of the dough, she worked away the humiliation of the stagecoach driver. With every press of her heavy palms, she pushed out the haunting echoes of the city matrons who called her a lumbering beast. Here, in the quiet solitude of the mill, her immense physical power was not a curse. It was the very instrument of creation. By the time the brutal storm outside finally began to wane, giving way to the pale, bruised purple light of early dawn, the heavy dough had transformed. It was smooth, elastic, and perfectly alive. She shaped it with a surprising, profound gentleness, scoring the top with a sharp paring knife she located in a nearby drawer, and settled it deep into the hot coals of the stone hearth she had painstakingly revived in the dark. Upstairs, in his cold and sparsely furnished quarters, Thaddeus slowly opened his sharp, observant brown eyes. He was accustomed to waking with a heavy, suffocating tightness in his chest. For a decade, morning had merely signaled the beginning of another day to endure, another day of punishing labor designed to silence the agonizing ghosts of his past. He expected the familiar metallic scent of damp, cold, and wet ash. Instead, an entirely different aroma drifted up through the floorboards. It was the intoxicating, deeply fragrant smell of toasted yeast, caramelized crust, and profound warmth. It was a scent that carried the undeniable, heartbreaking memory of a home he had lost to the unforgiving winter fever long ago. The sheer force of the fragrance struck the towering mountain man like a physical blow. His massive chest hitched. A dangerous, long-forgotten ache bloomed behind his ribs. Thaddeus threw off his heavy woolen blanket, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as he pulled on his weathered suspenders and heavy leather boots. He descended the narrow wooden stairs with quiet, measured steps, his broad shoulders brushing the narrow walls. He did not know what to expect. He had left a broken, stranded giant shivering in the dark. He pushed open the heavy oak door to the kitchen. The room was utterly transformed. The bitter, damp chill was entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, encompassing heat. Matilda sat quietly on a low wooden stool by the roaring fire, her long, slightly messy blonde hair drying in soft waves around her strong, resolute face. Her immense, powerful thighs and broad shoulders were visibly exhausted from the night of labor, dusted heavily with fine white flour. She looked up at him, her expression guarded but deeply respectful. Resting upon the center of the wooden table was a magnificent, perfectly baked loaf of bread. Its golden brown crust cracked elegantly along the scored lines, releasing tendrils of fragrant, mouth-watering steam into the cool morning air. Thaddeus stopped dead, in his tracks. His imposing, deeply protective presence filled the small room, but all of his defensive armor seemed to momentarily fracture at the sight of the offering. He approached the table slowly, as if approaching a mirage that might vanish if he moved too quickly. "You made this," Thaddeus murmured, his deep, resonant voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire. "You offered me shelter," Matilda breathed softly, remaining seated, keeping her towering frame low so she would not crowd him in the tight space. "I had nothing else to offer in return. I only know how to work." Thaddeus reached out. He did not ask for a knife. He simply placed his large, thick hands upon the warm crust and broke the loaf in half. A symphony of soft crunches filled the quiet room as the tender, steaming center pulled apart. He lifted a small, torn piece to his mouth, closing his eyes as he took the first bite. The flavor was a complete revelation. It was rich, earthy, perfectly salted, and unbelievably tender. It tasted of pure, unadulterated comfort. It tasted like sunlight breaking through a bitter winter fog, melting the frost that had tightly gripped his heart for a decade. He chewed slowly, processing not just the sustenance, but the profound care woven into every single crumb. The hardened, stoic gristmill owner swallowed hard. He opened his sharp brown eyes and looked down at the massive, misunderstood woman, sitting quietly by his hearth. A tiny, imperceptible sliver of trust anchored itself deep within his fiercely guarded soul. He realized then that she was not a beast at all. She was an artist trapped inside a fortress of muscle. I consume only hardtack and oats, Thaddeus muttered. His voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion he fought fiercely to conceal. I do not know how to appreciate such things. Good bread requires no appreciation. Sir, Matilda replied gently, her gaze steady and exceptionally kind. It only requires hunger. And everyone is hungry. Thaddeus stared at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the wild dust on her dress, the heavy muscles built from cruelty, and the gentle, extraordinary heart hiding beneath it all. My mill generates a fair profit, but I have no time to bake, Thaddeus stated firmly, his tone shifting into something decisive and resolute. You will stay. I will pay you a proper wage to manage this kitchen. You are no longer stranded. Matilda parted her lips, her chest swelling with a sudden breathless rush of hope. She had a place. She had a purpose. For the very first time in her difficult life, someone looked at her towering frame and saw immense value rather than a cumbersome burden. She slowly stood up, her immense height nearly matching his own, ready to accept the generous offer. Before she could utter a single word of gratitude, a frantic, aggressive pounding echoed from the front of the mill. The heavy blows against the reinforced wooden door shattered the delicate healing quiet of the morning. Thaddeus turned his massive head sharply, his broad shoulders immediately tensing with pure defensive instinct. His sanctuary was strictly private, hidden away from the prying eyes of the town. Nobody ever came to the mill this early, especially not after a devastating storm. Miller, a sharp, demanding voice shouted from the muddy yard outside, the sound carrying easily over the rushing noise of the swollen river. Open these doors. I know you are in there, and I demand to know where that sweet aroma is coming from right this instant. Thaddeus and Matilda exchanged a tense, uncertain glance. The quiet, fragile sanctuary they had just begun to build was already breached, and the outside world was furiously demanding entry. What would the town do when they discovered a giant hiding behind the miller's door? Thaddeus moved with the heavy, silent grace of a mountain predator. He placed one large, calloused hand firmly upon the doorframe, his shadow stretching long and imposing across the kitchen floor. He did not look at Matilda, but his presence clearly signaled for her to remain in the shadows of the hearth. The demand from outside came again, louder and more insistent, as accompanied by the frantic thud of a boot against the heavy timber of the main entrance. He walked toward the mill floor, his heavy boots striking the wood with deliberate, rhythmic authority. He unlatched the massive iron bar that secured the main doors and swung them wide open. Standing in the mud, shivering despite the heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders, was a middle-aged woman with sharp, angular features and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She was the town's unofficial magistrate, a woman who measured everything in the valley by its utility and social standing. Miller, the woman snapped, peering past Thaddeus into the dark, cavernous depths of the mill. The entire district smells of fresh-baked yeast. That is impossible. Your hearth has been cold for years. What is happening in here? Thaddeus stood like a granite cliff, blocking their path completely. I have no need to explain my internal affairs to you, Martha. Do not play coy with me, the woman retorted, her gaze sharpening, as she caught a flicker of movement behind Thaddeus. Her eyes landed on Matilda, who had moved closer to the mill floor, her massive, muscular stature impossible to hide. The woman's jaw dropped. Good heavens, who is this? A traveler? A vagrant? Matilda stepped into the weak morning light. She did not shrink. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her hands wiped clean of the flour that had been her labor of love. She felt the scrutiny of the townspeople like a physical weight, but she remembered the taste of the bread Thaddeus had shared. She knew her worth now, even if they did not. I am a baker, Matilda said, her voice steady, resonant, and calm. The merchant pushed forward, his eyes locked on the kitchen doorway. A baker? Here? Let me see that loaf. Before Thaddeus could stop him, the man surged past the threshold. He rushed into the kitchen, his eyes widening as he saw the remaining half of the golden brown bread sitting on the table. He did not ask permission. He snatched up the loaf, inhaled deeply, and took a ravenous bite, His eyes rolled back in his head. This, the man gasped, his mouth full. This is not from the dry hardtack the general store sells. This is like heaven. The news spread through the town like wildfire. By noon, the mill, which had been a place of profound solitude for a decade, was swarming with people. They came from the houses, the shops, and the surrounding homesteads. They stood in line in the mud, their voices a constant, low buzz of curiosity and demand. Inside, Matilda worked with a focus that defied the chaos. She had no time to be intimidated. She had a purpose. She moved massive sacks of grain, hauled heavy buckets of water, and worked the dough with a power that left the onlookers stunned into silence. They had never seen a woman move with such raw physical capability, yet with such profound, deliberate gentleness. Thaddeus stood by the grinding stones, watching her. He felt a strange protective stirring in his chest. He saw how the townspeople stared at her, some with suspicion, some with genuine wonder, others with a lingering, judgmental doubt. He saw the way she handled the heat of the oven, her massive, muscular back glistening with sweat, her blonde hair tied back with a rough piece of twine. She was a force of nature. He moved to her side as she struggled to lift a particularly heavy crate of supplies. He did not take it from her. He simply placed his hands on the opposite end, matching her rhythm. They moved in perfect, unspoken synchronization. They will not stop, Thaddeus murmured. His voice a low vibration only she could hear. They are hungry, Matilda replied. Her eyes focused on the dough she was shaping. Hunger is not a choice, Thaddeus. It is a need. They are judging you, Matilda. They see only the outside. Then I will let them taste the inside, she said. Her voice soft but filled with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The day stretched into evening. The line never once shortened. By the time the final person left, Matilda was utterly spent. She leaned against the heavy stone of the hearth, her breathing slow and controlled, her muscles trembling with the fatigue of a day's worth of backbreaking. Beautiful work. Thaddeus approached her, a tin of water in his hand. He held it out, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were soft. You have done more for this town in one day than I have done in 10 years. I only did what I know, she whispered. As they stood in the quiet, flour-dusted kitchen, the silence of the mill felt different. It was no longer a tomb of dead memories. It was a breathing space of life. But the peace was short-lived. The heavy door opened once more, and Martha, the town magistrate, stepped inside. She held a notebook in one hand and a pencil in the other, her face etched with a mix of curiosity and cold, calculated assessment. She looked at the wreckage of flour on the floor and the sheer, massive presence of the woman who had caused such a stir. It is a triumph, Martha declared, though her tone held no warmth. She clicked her pencil. Everyone is talking about it. However, if this is to be a sanctioned business, we require documentation. We need to know your processes, your methods, and most importantly, your quantities. The town council needs the exact measurements for your recipes, Matilda. For consistency. For safety. Matilda froze. She felt the air leave her lungs. The familiar terror of the city orphanage, of the matrons holding rulers and scales, of the constant, brutal shaming for being inaccurate, rushed back into her mind. She looked at Thaddeus, her eyes wide, searching for a shield. Martha stepped closer, peering at the flour-dusted table. Well, I have the ledger right here. How much flour? Exactly. Did you use? How much water? How many grams of salt? The mill went deathly silent. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a Gilead blade. Matilda looked at her hands, the very tools that had fed the town, and then back at the magistrate's cold, demanding face. How could she explain that she did not use cups or scales, that she measured with her heart, when that truth had been the source of all her pain? The air in the kitchen grew stifling, thick, with the scent of cooling yeast and the sudden, suffocating pressure of Martha's expectations. Matilda stared at the leather-bound ledger, the ink on the pristine pages appearing as sharp and unforgiving as a knife blade. She could not speak. The words lodged in her throat, heavy and cold. How could she explain that her hands did not calculate weights? They only recognized truths. How could she tell this woman that measuring cups and iron scales were not tools of efficiency, but instruments of her own long-buried torment? Martha tapped her pencil impatiently against the wooden table, her expression hardening as the silence stretched thin. I am waiting, woman. A baker of your stature must have a method. Unless, of course, you are merely guessing? This is a serious establishment now. We cannot have the health of our townspeople reliant upon a whim. Matilda looked down at her hands. They were large, calloused, and dusted with the white remnants of the day's labor. In the city, the matrons had often used rulers to strike her knuckles when she could not hold the heavy metal vessels steady enough to meet their precise exacting standards. They had mocked her hands, calling them clumsy, thick, and incapable of the delicacy required for proper housewifery. Every time she had reached for a cup, she had anticipated the inevitable sting of a rebuke. Eventually, she had stopped reaching for them altogether. She had turned inward, relying on the warmth of the fire, the texture of the flour against her skin, and the rhythm of her own heartbeat to tell her when a loaf was ready to be baked. It was how she had survived. It was how she had kept the kindness within her alive, by discarding the cold, rigid tools that had sought to break her. I do not guess, Matilda whispered, her voice rough with a vulnerability she despised. She dared not raise her eyes to meet Thaddeus, who stood in the corner, his presence a dark, silent shadow against the wall. She felt certain that he, too, would be disappointed. He was a man of the mill, a man of mechanical precision. He surely believed in the necessity of structure. I simply feel the dough. It tells me what it requires. Martha let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She turned to the few other townspeople who had wandered into the kitchen, their faces twisted with skepticism. She feels the dough? My heavens, we are trusting our harvest to a brute who works by instinct alone. The word hung in the air, brute. It was a word that had followed Matilda from the orphanage to the stagecoach, and now it had arrived here, in the one place she had dared to believe might offer her sanctuary. It is not scientific, Martha continued, her voice rising, drawing more onlookers from the mill floor. It is uneducated. It is dangerous. How can we ensure consistency? What happens when you are tired? What happens when your feelings fail? We require a standard. Girl, do you not understand? Civilization is built upon measurement. Matilda flinched. The weight of the shame was absolute. She had truly believed, for a few short hours, that she had found a place where her size was not a liability and her lack of civilization was not a sin. She realized now that she was fooling herself. She would always be the towering, muscular outcast, the woman who took up too much space and did not fit the delicate, measured molds of the world. She reached up and untied the apron Thaddeus had provided, folding it slowly with shaking hands. I do not wish to cause trouble for the miller, Matilda said, her voice quiet and resolute, masking the absolute shattering of her hope. She turned to Thaddeus, keeping her gaze firmly on the floorboards. I will go. I have caused enough disruption to your business. She moved toward the door, her massive, broad-shouldered frame feeling more cumbersome and heavy than ever before. Every step felt like an admission of failure. She reached for the strap of her canvas bag, which she had kept tucked away in the corner of the pantry. She felt the heavy stares of the townspeople, some curious, some pitying, but most of them cold and judgmental. They saw a woman who could not even follow a recipe, a giant who was all muscle and no intellect. She walked toward the main exit, desperate to escape the humiliation. She did not look back. She could not bear to see the disappointment on Thaddeus's face. A man who had offered her a home only to realize she was not capable of upholding his standards. She reached the heavy oak door, her hand wrapping around the iron handle. She pulled, but the door did not budge. Matilda frowned. Pulling harder, the door remained shut. She turned around to see what was obstructing her path, expecting to see a crate or a piece of machinery. Instead, she found Thaddeus. He had moved with a speed that defied his massive, hulking size. He stood directly in front of the exit, his shoulders filling the entire breadth of the doorway. He was not looking at Martha. He was not looking at the townspeople. He was looking only at Matilda. His expression was impossible to decipher, a mixture of deep, quiet intensity and a simmering, protective anger that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. "Step aside, please," Matilda murmured, her voice trembling. "I am not fit for this. I do not have the measurements they require." Thaddeus did not move. He did not blink. He planted his boots firmly on the floor, his massive, powerful presence effectively sealing the exit. He looked past her, his gaze locking onto the magistrate, Martha. His eyes were sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of the hospitality he had shown earlier. "You've had your say, Martha?" Thaddeus said, his voice deep, resonant, and dangerously calm. It was not a request. It was a command that silenced the room instantly. "You have inspected the mill, you have tasted the bread, and now you are finished." "Thaddeus, do not be foolish," Martha snapped, though she took a hesitant step backward. "She cannot operate a business without standards. It is for the good of the town." "The town," Thaddeus stated, his voice low and vibrating with a power that made the floorboards beneath them tremble, "is hungry. They were hungry when they came here this morning, and they will be hungry tomorrow. Matilda has fed them more than bread today. She has fed them a kindness that you seem entirely unable to comprehend." He turned his full attention back to Matilda. He did not take the apron from her hands. He did not tell her to stay. He simply looked at her, his observant brown eyes searching her face, seeing past the shame and the tears she refused to shed. He saw the terror of the little girl who had been punished for being different. And he saw the woman who had fought to keep her heart warm in a world of ice. "You will not leave," Thaddeus muttered, his words intended for her alone, yet carrying through the silent mill like a thunderclap. "We have not finished the work." Matilda stood paralyzed, her hand still gripping the cold iron of the door handle. The townspeople watched, in stunned silence, waiting to see what the reclusive miller would do next. The air was electric, charged with the sudden, violent shifting of the foundations. They all thought they understood. What would this man do to prove she belonged? Silence. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest of every person in the room. Thaddeus did not move from the doorway, his massive frame acting as an impenetrable wall between the curious, judging eyes of the town and the woman who stood trembling behind him. He looked at Martha, the magistrate, with a cold, unwavering intensity that drained the color from her face. "The mill is private property," Thaddeus stated, his voice devoid of any emotion, yet vibrating with a threat so potent that no one dared to breathe. "You have your answer. Leave." Martha sputtered, her hand tightening around the strap of her ledger. She looked to the men beside her, seeking support, but they were already backing away, their gazes fixed firmly on the floor. He winced from the ache. They knew better than to challenge the miller when his patience had reached its end. Without a single word of protest, they turned and shuffled out into the darkening evening, the magistrate shooting one final venomous look over her shoulder before the heavy door slammed shut. The latch clicked into place with a definitive, final sound. Matilda remained by the table, her hands still resting on the apron she had prepared to surrender. She looked up slowly, her gaze colliding with Thaddeus's. He had turned back to face her, his massive shoulders still tense, his jaw set in a line of granite. He did not speak immediately. He walked across the room, his movements heavy and deliberate, and stopped only when he stood directly before her. He towered over her, yet for the first time, she did not feel small. She felt seen. "You will not go," he murmured, the anger in his voice receding like the tide, leaving behind a deep, resonant calm. "You belong here. They will return," Matilda whispered, looking at the door, then back to the man whose protection had just shielded her from the cruelty of the world. "They will demand their measurements, Thaddeus. They will not accept my way." Thaddeus reached out, his thick, calloused fingers brushing the flour-dusted surface of the wooden table. He did not look at her, but his eyes were fixed on the hearth, the place where she had performed her silent, intuitive alchemy. He seemed to be making a calculation, one that went far beyond the simple geometry of grain and stone. "If the town demands a standard," he replied, his voice rough and low, "then I will provide one that defies them." For the next 3 days, The mill was a scene of relentless, back-breaking transformation. Thaddeus did not allow Matilda to help with the heavy labor, though she insisted. Her own muscles itching to move, to lift, to contribute. He was immovable. He spent his hours in the riverbed, hauling massive, smooth river stones back to the mill, his skin slick with sweat, his clothes heavy with the dust of the valley. He built a fire outside to heat his tools, and he labored with a singular, ferocious purpose that bordered on the obsessive. He was not merely building a structure, he was crafting a fortress for her art. He dismantled the small, insufficient hearth, and in its place, began to erect a massive, heavy-duty stone oven. It was an architectural marvel of the frontier, a structure that demanded the immense physical power he possessed. He mortared the stones with a mixture of clay and sand that he had tempered himself, his hands working in a rhythm that mimicked the heartbeat of the earth. He built it to hold heat, to distribute warmth with an evenness that no metal tool could ever hope to replicate. It was a kiln of his own design, massive enough to accommodate the bread she baked, yet elegant in its rugged, mountain-hewn simplicity. Matilda watched him from the shadows, her heart swelling with an emotion she struggled to name. She had been used to being the strong one, the one who carried the weight, the one who was expected to labor without complaint. To watch this man, this giant of the mountains, pour his own strength into a project designed solely to honor her existence, left her breathless. It was a sacred sacrifice of his time, his energy, and his solitude. He was breaking down the walls of his own reclusive life to make space for her, stone by stone. By the evening of the third day, the oven stood complete. It was a testament to his devotion, a permanent, immovable fixture in the heart of the mill. Thaddeus finished the final layer of stone and stepped back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He looked entirely exhausted, his hair matted with sweat, his clothes stained, but his eyes were alight with a pride she had not yet seen. He gestured toward the massive opening of the oven. "It is ready," he said, his voice raspy from disuse and labor. Matilda approached the oven, her hand trailing over the rough, warm surface of the stone. She could feel the latent heat radiating from it, a steady, pulsing warmth that welcomed her. It was stronger than anything she had ever used, more durable than any tool she had ever been denied. It was hers. They stood together, in the cooling evening. The only sound, the gentle rushing of the river outside, and the crackle of the wood fire Thaddeus had lit within the new hearth. The air was thick with the scent of stone and smoke, a grounding, elemental perfume. Matilda turned to him, her eyes shining in the soft, flickering light. "You have built me a castle, Thaddeus. I have built a place for the work," he replied, though his gaze softened as it lingered on her face, tracing the lines of her strength, the resolve in her features, the quiet grace of her presence. She reached out, driven by an impulse she could not contain, and placed her hand upon his forearm. Her palm, broad and strong, rested against the dense, hard muscle of his arm. She wanted to thank him, not with words, which felt inadequate, but with the simple, human connection of touch. Thaddeus stiffened. The contact was brief, a mere second of skin against skin, but it seemed to act as a physical catalyst. He looked down at her hand, and then up into her eyes, his expression undergoing a rapid, violent shift. The warmth that had been present in his gaze only moments before vanished, replaced by a shadow of profound, soul-deep pain. His breath hitched. The memory of the past. A laughter, a smile, the touch of a hand that no longer existed, seared through his mind with the sudden, sharp clarity of lightning. He pulled his arm away, as if the contact had burned him. He stumbled back, his eyes widening, and he turned his back to her, clutching the edge of the stone oven, with hands that shook uncontrollably. Matilda froze, her hand hovering in the empty air, the warmth of his skin still lingering on her palm. She stood alone, in the dim light of the mill, the silence now heavy with the weight of his hidden, agonizing past. What ghost had he just seen in the lines of her hand, and why did the simple act of her kindness strike him with such visible, raw terror? The heavy silence stretched between them, a chasm carved by years of unspoken grief and sudden, startling vulnerability. Thaddeus stood near the stone oven, his back to Matilda, his large frame rigid as the masonry he had just completed. He did not turn around. He did not speak. The simple, human connection of her hand on his arm had shattered the walls he had meticulously constructed of around his heart, and now he was retreating into the safety of the ruins. Matilda stood in the cooling air of the kitchen, her hand still tingling where she had touched his skin. The rejection was not angry, it was wounded. It was the terrified retreat of a man who feared that any joy he allowed himself to touch would inevitably turn to ash. She understood that fear intimately. She had lived her entire life, guarding her heart against the inevitable sting of loss. She turned away, her movements slow and heavy. She did not follow him. She did not demand an explanation. She simply retreated to the opposite side of the room, her heart aching with a profound, quiet empathy. She would wait. She would be the steady, grounding presence he clearly did not know he needed yet. The days that followed were marked by a strange, tense rhythm. The harvest festival was rapidly approaching, and the entire valley was abuzz with anticipation. The town council had officially approached Matilda, requesting that she bake the centerpiece for this harvest feast, a massive tiered loaf that would symbolize the prosperity of the season. It was the highest honor a baker could receive in the valley, a public validation of her craft. For Matilda, the honor was a double-edged sword. It was an opportunity to prove her worth, to secure her place in this community, and to show Thaddeus that her intuition was a gift, not a flaw. Yet, the pressure was immense. She knew that the eyes of the town would be upon her. If she failed, it would not just be a matter of a spoiled loaf of bread. It would confirm every doubt the skeptics had whispered about the giant woman and her unmeasured methods. Elias, the town's long-standing baker, watched these developments with a heart curdled by envy. He had spent his life adhering to the strict, measured standards of the trade, and his business had sustained the town for decades. Now his prestige was being eclipsed by a newcomer who did not even own a scale. He was a man defined by his reputation, and he viewed Matilda's success as a personal, direct assault on his identity. On the morning before the festival, the delivery wagon arrived at the mill. It was the same driver who had begrudgingly brought the weekly grain supplies. He jumped down from the driver's seat, his movements hurried and nervous, casting quick, darting glances at the mill door, before unloading the sacks of flour Matilda had ordered for the centerpiece. "Delivery for the baker," the driver muttered, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. Matilda emerged from the mill, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked toward the wagon, her massive, graceful strides covering the distance in seconds. She reached out to lift the first sack, her muscles rippling beneath the fabric of her dress. "I will help you with those," the driver said quickly, stepping between her and the wagon. "I have instructions to place them directly inside the kitchen." Matilda paused, her brow furrowing. It was unusual, but she shrugged it off as a courtesy. She stood aside as the man hauled the heavy sacks into the mill's storage room, his breathing ragged, his face pale. He dropped the last sack with a heavy final thud and hurried back to his wagon, disappearing down the road before Matilda could even offer a word of thanks. A strange, prickling sensation settled at the back of her neck. She walked into the storage room, the air thick with the scent of raw grain. She approached the newly delivered sacks. She needed the finest quality for the festival centerpiece. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough burlap. She did not need to open the bag to know something was wrong. Her instincts, honed by years of labor and an intuitive connection to her materials, screamed a warning. She untied the cord of the first sack and plunged her hand into the flour. She pulled out a handful, letting it sift through her fingers. It was not the dry, dusty, pristine flour she expected. It was damp, slightly clotted, and it carried a faint, sour odor, the unmistakable, heartbreaking scent of mildew and rot. Matilda's stomach dropped. She checked the second sack. The same. The third. Ruined. She leaned against the wooden wall of the storage room, the shock radiating through her body. This was not an accident. Someone had deliberately sourced tainted flour and delivered it to her on the eve of the festival. They wanted her to fail. They wanted her to bring a moldy, inedible offering to the town square, to prove that her feeling was nothing more than incompetence. The fear was cold and sharp. If she used this flour, the bread would not rise. It would be dense, sour, and unpalatable. If she refused to bake, She would be seen as difficult, uncooperative, and unreliable. Either path led to the same result: total, humiliating failure. She looked at her massive calloused hands. They were the tools she had trusted above all else. But now, they felt entirely inadequate. How could she turn this rot into something worthy of a feast? The festival was tomorrow. There was no time to send for more supplies, no time to alert the town without appearing like she was making excuses. She stood in the dark, silent storage room, the weight of the sabotage pressing down upon her shoulders. She felt the familiar, crushing pressure of her past, the expectation of perfection, the looming threat of punishment for failure. She had escaped the orphanage, but she feared she had simply traded one set of walls for another. The mill door creaked open, and the heavy rhythmic thud of Thaddeus's boots echoed against the wooden floor. He walked into the kitchen, his presence filling the room with a sense of security she desperately needed, yet was terrified to ask for. He stopped when he saw her standing in the doorway of the storage room, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Matilda," his voice was low, laced with a concern he could not fully suppress. "What has happened?" She could not speak. She simply gestured toward the open sacks. Thaddeus walked to the storage room, his sharp, observant eyes assessing the flour in a single glance. He reached out, his thick fingers testing the texture, and the scent of the mildew wafted up, clear and offensive. His jaw tightened. The air around him seemed to grow heavy, charged, with a protective, dangerous heat. He understood immediately. He knew the politics of the town. He knew the bitterness of men like Elias, and he saw the setup for exactly what it was. "This is not our flour," he stated. His voice, a low, gravelly rumble. "It was delivered this morning," Matilda whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I cannot use this. I cannot bake the centerpiece with this." She felt the tears pressing against the back of her eyes, a rare, terrifying weakness. She was a woman who had carried mountains, but she felt as though she were shattering under the weight of this deception. Thaddeus turned his gaze from the flour to her. He saw the sheer, soul-deep terror in her expression, the fear of being exposed as a fraud, the fear of losing the home she had finally begun to build. He saw the little girl who had been punished for mistakes that were not her own. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, blocking out the light of the setting sun. He did not touch her, but his presence was a shield. "You have a choice, Matilda," he said, his words measured and direct. "You can walk away and tell them the supplies were spoiled. Or you can find a way to save the work." "How?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "This is ruined. It is poison to the bread." "It is only ruined if you allow it to be," Thaddeus replied, his eyes challenging her to reclaim the power she had surrendered to the fear. "You are the one with the hands. You are the one who knows the grain better than anyone else in this valley. Do not let them dictate your worth." He turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving her alone in the dim, stale air of the storage room. Matilda stood still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the tainted sacks again. She had a choice. She could retreat into the safety of an excuse, or she could gamble everything on the very intuition that had been mocked, scrutinized, and sabotaged. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but they were strong. She had spent a lifetime proving she was more than the brute the world expected her to be. She had spent a lifetime refining a gift that no one else understood. Was she strong enough to turn this disaster into a triumph? Or was the sabotaged flower the final, insurmountable obstacle that would end her journey here? With a sudden, sharp intake of breath, she reached into the sack. She did not pull her hand away. She plunged it deeper, feeling the damp, clotted mass, searching for the core, searching for a way to salvage the impossible. The clock was ticking, and the festival was only hours away. What drastic, unprecedented decision would she make to fix the dough, and would her ancient, silent instincts be enough to save them both? Or would this single, fateful act of defiance ruin them permanently? The moonlight filtered through the single high window of the mill, casting long silver fingers across the floor. Matilda did not look at the moon. She looked only at the mountain of ruined flour spread across a clean, heavy canvas sheet. Her hands, massive and steady, moved with a surgical precision that belied her towering, imposing physique. She had realized, in the cold, desperate silence of the storage room, that the sabotage was not absolute. The mildew had touched the surface, but beneath the damp, clotted crust, the heart of the grain remained pure. She began the long, agonizing process of reclamation. She did not use a mechanical sifter. She used her fingers. She broke the clots apart, feeling for the slight change in texture that signaled the presence of rot, separating the contaminated dust from the clean. Golden heart of the wheat, with an intimacy that felt almost like prayer. It was slow, back-breaking work. Her shoulders burned and her fingers grew numb, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Thaddeus stood by the grinding stones, his large, calloused hands resting on the iron handle. He had watched her for hours, his sharp, observant eyes tracking every movement of her powerful, fluid frame. He did not offer to help, for he knew that the labor was hers alone, a trial by fire that she needed to survive to prove her own worth to herself. He merely provided the environment, keeping the hearth stoked, the water boiled, and the shadows at bay. He was a sentinel in the dark, his presence a silent, unwavering support that anchored her to the earth. As the night deepened, the atmosphere in the mill shifted. The tension of the sabotage faded, replaced by the rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of their shared existence. Matilda reached for a heavy bucket of water, her muscles coiling and releasing beneath her dress, and Thaddeus was there before she could fully lift it. He took the handle from her, his large, rough hand brushing hers, and carried it to the stone basin, placing it down with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his rugged, mountain-hardened exterior. "You have been working since dusk," Thaddeus murmured. His voice, a low, gravelly vibration that barely disturbed the quiet. "The bread does not recognize the hour," Matilda replied, her gaze focused on the white powder coating her arms. "It only recognizes the need." She returned to the canvas, her fingers moving again, and Thaddeus returned to his post by the hearth. There was no need for idle conversation. The shared labor had created a space between them that felt more profound than any speech. It was a space built on mutual respect, on the recognition of strength, and on the slow, creeping warmth of a connection that neither of them had anticipated. Matilda felt his eyes upon her, not with the judgment of the town, nor with the fear of a man who had lost everything, but with a gaze that saw the woman behind the muscle. When the final bag was cleared, when the piles of clean grain sat ready for the kneading, Matilda was exhausted. She sank onto a wooden bench near the fire, her chest heaving, her hair loose and tangled around her shoulders. She felt the weight of her own body, the glorious, aching fatigue that followed a task completed against all odds. Thaddeus crossed the room, his movements silent despite his size. He carried a mug of strong, black coffee, the only thing he truly consumed, and he placed it in her hands. His skin was warm, his touch lingers for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. "You have salvaged the harvest," he stated, his tone carrying a note of quiet, profound admiration. "I have salvaged the truth," Matilda corrected, her voice soft. "It was never about the flour. It was about whether I would let them decide what I was capable of doing." She drank the coffee, the heat spreading through her veins, chasing away the chill of the night. She looked at Thaddeus, who stood beside the stone oven he had built for her, his silhouette etched against the dying embers of the fire. "Why do you stay in this mill, Thaddeus?" she asked, her voice filled with a genuine, gentle curiosity. "You are a man of the mountains. You could go anywhere, you could do anything. But you choose to stay here, in the dark, alone." Thaddeus stiffened. The question was a sharp, sudden probe into the wound he had spent 10 years keeping closed. He turned his face away, his gaze fixed on the shadows near the back wall. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching out until the only sound was the distant, rushing river and the soft crackle of the hearth. "I do not stay because I choose to," he finally whispered, his voice so low it was almost lost in the room. "I stay because I cannot leave. I built this life around the memory of what I lost." Matilda set the mug down, her heart aching for the man who stood before her, so strong and yet so profoundly shattered. She did not stand, but she leaned forward, her eyes locked on his back, her entire being focused on listening. The winter fever, he continued, his words slow, disjointed, as if they were jagged rocks he was pulling from his own throat. It was 12 years ago. The valley was cut off by snow. No doctor could reach us. My wife, Sarah, and our little girl, Anna, they were both so full of life. They were the center of everything I knew. He turned slowly to face her. His expression was a raw, devastating landscape of grief. The stoic, unbreakable mountain man was gone, replaced by a soul that had been hollowed out by an agony he had never been able to voice. I tried to save them, he confessed, his hands clenching at his sides until his knuckles turned white. I hauled wood through the storm until my feet bled. I ground the grain until my hands were raw. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I did enough, if I was strong enough, I could hold back the tide of nature itself. I thought I could measure their survival with my own effort. He took a jagged, uneven breath. But I was wrong. I was just a man. And the winter took them anyway. Matilda felt the tears pricking at her eyes. But she did not look away. She recognized that pain. It was the pain of a heart that had tried to build a dam against the inevitability of loss. I could not face the town, Thaddeus added, his voice breaking. Every face I saw reminded me of what I had lost. So, I retreated here. I made this mill my tomb. I believed that if I did not let anyone in, if I did not let myself feel anything, I would never have to lose anything again. He looked at her, his eyes searching, a terrifying vulnerability shining in their depths. But you came here, Matilda. You walked through my door with your flower and your strength and your stubborn, quiet courage. And for the first time in 10 years, I am terrified. I am terrified that you are the next thing I will have to lose. The confession hung in the air, a devastating, beautiful, and heavy truth. The stoic protector had finally lowered his shield, revealing the bruised and tender heart beneath the mountain of muscle. The quiet hours of the dawn were upon them, casting a pale, fragile light into the mill. What would Matilda do, now that the silent, grieving man had placed the weight of his heart directly into her hands, and how would she navigate the delicate, dangerous space of this new, shared sorrow? The silence that followed Thaddeus's confession was absolute, held together by the lingering embers of the hearth and the pale, fragile promise of the coming dawn. Matilda did not rush to fill the quiet with hollow reassurances. She understood the sanctity of the pain he had just laid bare. She did not attempt to minimize his loss, nor did she offer empty words about the passage of time. She simply stood in the space he had carved out, acknowledging the gravity of the grief he had carried, alone for over a decade. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate and slow. She did not cross the room with the haste of a woman seeking to comfort a child. She approached him as an equal, her massive, muscular frame moving with a quiet, grounded grace. She stopped only when she stood within the shadow of his towering height. Thaddeus remained turned away, his hands still white-knuckled, as he gripped the edge of the stone oven. His shoulders were heaving, a silent, internal struggle against the dam that had finally broken. He looked like a man who had been braced against a hurricane for 10 years, only to find himself suddenly standing in the eye of the storm. Matilda reached out. She did not place a hand on his arm this time, for she knew he was too raw for such contact to be anything but startling. Instead, she placed her hand upon his shoulder, her palm broad and warm, anchoring him to the present moment. She did not squeeze, nor did she pull him toward her. She simply rested her hand there, a silent, steadfast weight that said she was not going anywhere. You tried to carry the world, Matilda whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft crackle of the dying fire. You tried to be the wall that stopped the winter. But a man is not a mountain, Thaddeus. You were never meant to carry that weight alone. He shuddered. The contact, gentle and unwavering, seemed to be the final tether that kept him from drifting into the abyss of his memories. Slowly, the rigidity left his frame. His shoulders dropped, the tension draining out of him in a long, ragged exhale. He did not turn to face her, but he shifted, his weight leaning almost imperceptibly toward her touch. I have been so tired, he murmured, his voice thick and broken, a sound that tore at the very fabric of Matilda's heart. I have been so tired for so long. He moved then, a slow, yielding turn that brought him to face her. He looked down, his eyes dark with the remnants of his torment, but the desperate, frantic energy of his grief had vanished. He closed the distance between them, his towering height looming over her, and then, with a heavy, final sigh of surrender, he rested his head against her shoulder. It was an act of profound, agonizing vulnerability. The man who had been the pillar of the valley, the solitary protector of the mill, was now resting his burden on someone else. Matilda stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath hitching in her chest. She felt the heavy warmth of his head against her collarbone, the ragged rhythm of his breathing, the sheer, solid reality of him. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him in close, creating a sanctuary within the sanctuary of the mill. She held him not as a woman holding a man, but as a spirit holding a spirit. They were two mountains, ancient and scarred, finding a moment of reprieve in the vast, unforgiving landscape of their lives. In that embrace, the mill ceased to be a tomb of dead memories. It became a garden of new beginnings. The emotional dependence was not a weakness, it was a bridge. He was learning that he did not have to survive the night alone, and she was learning that her strength was not a barrier to being loved, but the very foundation upon which a life could be built. As the sun began to climb above the peaks of the mountains, casting golden light through the dust-moted air of the mill, they eventually pulled apart. The world outside remained, waiting, demanding. The harvest festival would not wait for the healing of a broken heart. They prepared the centerpiece in the silent, clear light of morning. It was a massive, intricate loaf, crafted from the reclaimed flour and baked in the oven Thaddeus had built. It was a masterpiece of texture and form, a testament to Matilda's intuition and the strength of their combined purpose. When it was finished, it sat on the table like a jewel, golden, fragrant, and perfect. Thaddeus helped her place it onto a sturdy wooden board. He looked at the bread, and then at Matilda, his eyes clear and steady. The ghost of his past had not vanished, but it no longer held him captive. "They will see it," Thaddeus stated, his voice now firm, carrying the weight of his renewed resolve. "They will see the work you have done." They walked together to the town square, the board cradled between their 4 hands. The festival was in full swing, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat, spiced cider, and the chatter of 100 voices. As they approached, the crowd parted. They saw the massive, imposing woman and the towering, grim-faced miller, and they fell silent. The sight of them, together, a matched set of resilience, was more striking than the bread itself. Matilda felt the weight of the town's scrutiny, the legacy of their judgment. But she did not shrink. She walked, with her head held high, her feet planted firmly on the earth. She looked at Thaddeus, and she saw the fierce, protective pride in his eyes. They reached the center table, where the town council, Fuss, and the local merchants had gathered. Standing at the front of the group, with a face pinched by jealousy, and a scale held in his hands like a weapon, was Elias, the rival baker. He had been waiting for them. He did not look at the bread. He looked at Matilda, his eyes narrowing with a calculated, malicious intent. He stepped forward, obstructing their path, the metal, scale in his hands glinting in the morning sun. "The centerpiece," Elias sneered, his voice loud enough to carry across the square, ensuring everyone was listening. "The town deserves perfection, Matilda. Not guesswork. Not intuition." He gestured to the scale, his movements performative, designed to humiliate. "I have heard reports of your methods. I have heard that you work by feeling. We cannot have fraud at the harvest table. We cannot have a centerpiece that lacks the required consistency. It must be weighed. It must be verified against the standards of the trade." He shoved the scale toward her, his gaze triumphant. "Prove it, giant. Prove that your work is not a gamble. Let us see exactly how much your intuition is worth." The crowd murmured. The air turned cold, the festive atmosphere shattering under the weight of the challenge. Matilda felt the familiar, crushing pressure of her past, the expectation of perfection, the looming threat of public disgrace. The scale sat between them, a cold, unyielding piece of metal that had been the bane of her existence since childhood. Would she submit to the measurement, or would the very act of standing firm be enough to destroy her in the eyes of the town? The silence in the town square was so profound that Matilda could hear the distant, rhythmic creaking of the mill wheel back at the river. The metal scale in Elias's hands seemed to absorb the sunlight, casting a sharp, clinical reflection across the table. It was a sterile, unforgiving object, and to Matilda, it represented the very antithesis of the nourishment she provided. It represented judgment. It represented the cold, rigid metrics of a world that had always told her that her size was a transgression, and her methods were a chaotic mess. She looked at the scale, and the memory of the orphanage matron returned with devastating clarity. She could almost feel the phantom sting of the ruler against her knuckles, a punishment for the uneven edges of a pastry, a correction for the wildness of her technique. She was a giantess, a runaway, a woman of muscle and hard labor, and standing here in the center of the town, she felt the old, familiar shame creeping up her throat like a poison. She was exposed. She was inadequate. She was nothing more than an unrefined brute playing at being a baker. Matilda's shoulders slumped, her gaze dropping to the dirt. She turned to leave, her massive, muscular form seemingly shrinking within the folds of her dress. "I cannot satisfy your demand, Elias," she whispered, her voice tight, the hope she had cherished only hours, before beginning to dissolve into the dust beneath her boots. "I do not have the measurements you seek." A cruel, satisfied smirk spread across Elias's face. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming with a false, performative concern. "You see, it is as I suspected. There is no craft here, only luck, only the guesswork of an uneducated woman who does not understand the first thing about the dignity of our trade. How can we trust our harvest to this?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Some of the townspeople began to murmur, their faces clouding with doubt. The initial magic of the bread, the comfort they had felt in their own kitchens, seemed to evaporate, replaced by the rigid, logical fear that Elias had stoked. They looked at Matilda, and for a moment, they saw only the giant woman, the outsider, the mystery they could not quantify. Then, a shadow fell across the table. Thaddeus stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to silence the square. He was a mountain of a man, his weathered face set in a mask of granite, his sharp, observant eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on Elias. He walked around the table, his heavy boots sounding like slow, deliberate drum beats against the earth. He reached out and took the scale from Elias's trembling hands. The rival baker stumbled back, his eyes wide, as Thaddeus weighed the object in his calloused palm. "You speak of standards." "Elias," Thaddeus said, his voice deep, resonant, and calm. "You speak as though civilization is built upon the precision of a metal scoop and a sliding weight." He looked up, scanning the faces of the townspeople, his gaze lingering on the older women, the mothers, the grandmothers, who had spent their lives sustaining this valley. "I recall my own grandmother," Thaddeus continued, his tone softening, losing the edge of threat, and gaining a weight of profound lived wisdom. "She lived through the winters that would have broken us all. She raised 6 children on nothing but grit and hope. And in all the years I watched her in the kitchen, I never once saw her pick up a measuring cup. I never saw her look at a scale." A hush fell over the crowd. "Why?" Thaddeus asked, his voice ringing with authority. "Because she knew that the bread she baked was not a chemical equation. It was a connection. She knew the flour by the way it felt against her skin. She knew the water by the heat of the hearth. She knew when the dough was ready, not because a clock told her so, but because her soul was in rhythm with the harvest. She understood that life and love and the sustenance that keeps a family together cannot be measured in cups and ounces. They can only be measured in the care we put into them." He looked at Matilda, his eyes filled with an intensity that held the crowd captive. "Matilda does not need your scales," Thaddeus declared, his voice rising to carry across the square. "She has something far more valuable. She has the wisdom of the earth in her hands. If you are hungry, you will taste the difference. If you are looking for a reason to judge, then you are the ones who are truly starving." He turned back to Elias and placed the scale gently, almost dismissively, on the wooden table. "Go home, Elias. Bake your measured, precise bread, but do not mistake your lack of intuition for virtue." Elias stood frozen, his face flushed with humiliation. He looked around, seeking support but found none. The crowd had turned. The older women, in particular, were nodding, their expressions softening as the memory of their own mothers and grandmothers rose to the surface, validating the truth in Thaddeus's words. The tension broke, the judgment replaced by a sudden, collective understanding. They realized that they had been looking for flaws in a gift that was meant to be received with an open heart. The townspeople began to approach the table, not with scales and ledgers, but with smiles and anticipation. They reached for the bread, their faces lighting up as they tore into the centerpiece, the flavor a testament to the care and devotion Matilda had poured into every fold of the dough. Matilda stood beside Thaddeus, her chest heaving, the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, overwhelmed by the fierce protective beauty of his defense. He had stood for her. He had taken her secret, her source of shame, and turned it into a symbol of pride. But as the festival continued and the laughter and music filled the square, Matilda noticed a change in the air. The golden light of the afternoon began to fade, replaced by a strange, unnatural grayness creeping over the mountain peaks. The wind, which had been a gentle, cooling breeze, began to pick up, carrying with it the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and the damp, earthy smell of coming rain. She looked toward the valley entrance, her instincts. The same instincts that told her when the dough was ready, warning her of a profound shift in the atmosphere. The birds had gone silent. The trees began to sway with a restless, nervous energy. Thaddeus, too, had noticed. He turned his head, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a dark, alert intensity. "It is not just a storm," he muttered, his voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of a dire prediction. "This is something else entirely." The crowd continued to celebrate, unaware of the threat, but Matilda felt the hair on her arms stand up. The sky was bruising, turning a deep, violent shade of charcoal. The valley, so vibrant and alive only moments ago, now felt small, fragile, and utterly exposed. What had the mountains brought down upon them? And would the sanctuary they had built be enough to withstand the coming fury? The transition from celebration to chaos was not a gradual descent. It was an abrupt tearing of the sky. The golden afternoon light, which had bathed the festival square in warmth, vanished as if extinguished by a giant, unseen hand. A heavy, suffocating silence fell upon the valley, the kind of stillness that preceded a catastrophe. Birds stopped their songs mid-note, and the wind began to howl from the high passes, a mournful, low-frequency sound that vibrated deep within the chest. Thaddeus stood at the edge of the square, his tall, broad-shouldered frame rigid, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the dark clouds were roiling like boiling ink. He knew this weather. He had lived in the shadow of these mountains for a lifetime, and he recognized the specific, dangerous energy of an autumn deluge. It was not a simple rain. It was a mountain-fed surge that would turn the peaceful river into a ravenous, destructive torrent. "The mill," Thaddeus murmured, his voice a low, urgent vibration that cut through the confused chatter of the villagers. "The river will rise within the hour." Matilda stood beside him, her gaze mirroring his intensity. She did not ask questions. She did not waste time with doubt. She saw the set of his jaw, the way he scanned the hillsides for the telltale signs of runoff, and she knew that his concern was valid. She felt a profound, grounding shift within herself. She was no longer the frightened girl who needed to be told where to stand. She was his partner, ready to act alongside him. "What do we do?" Matilda asked, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. Thaddeus looked down at her, his sharp, observant eyes meeting hers, with a flash of fierce, unshakable loyalty. The protection in his gaze was absolute. He did not treat her as a fragile thing to be moved to safety. He treated her as a capable, essential part of the survival. "We must secure the grain stocks," he commanded, his words clipped and efficient. "The mill is the heart of the town's winter stores. If the water breaches the lower levels, the valley will face starvation before the first snow. We must move the sacks to the upper loft." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing firmly with hers, his grip warm and calloused. It was an anchor in the rising tension of the afternoon. "Stay close to me," he added, his voice softening for a fraction of a second. He winced from the ache, just enough that his protective instincts were not merely for the grain, but for her. They moved together, a pair of powerful, purposeful figures cutting through the retreating crowd. The townspeople, sensing the shift in the air, began to disperse with frantic haste, mothers calling for their children, merchants shuttering their stalls. Thaddeus led Matilda toward the mill, his stride long and relentless. The wind whipped at their clothes, and the first fat, icy drops of rain began to splatter against the hard-packed earth. By the time they reached the mill, the sky had turned a bruised, unnatural charcoal. The river, usually a gentle murmuring companion to the mill, was already churning, its surface rising to lick at the banks with a dark, foamy tongue. Thaddeus did not hesitate. He threw open the heavy doors, and they entered the cavernous, dim space. The mill felt different now, not a sanctuary of peace, but a potential trap. The water outside was rising with terrifying speed, and the pressure of the river against the foundation was already audible, a low, ominous groaning of timber and stone. "We have to work quickly," Thaddeus said, moving to the heavy grain sacks. He hoisted a 100-pound bag of wheat onto his massive shoulder, as if it were a feather, his muscles straining against the weight, his movements fluid and precise. "The loft is high enough, but we must haul everything before the foundation floods." Matilda mirrored his exertion. She moved to the second stack, her own immense strength matching his. She lifted a heavy, coarse, woven sack, the rough fabric digging into her shoulder, and braced herself for the climb. Together, they became a machine of relentless, synchronized labor. They hauled sack after sack, their breathing heavy, their bodies slick with sweat that mingled with the damp chill of the rising storm. In the brief moments between trips, they caught glances of one another. Matilda saw the determination in his brow, the way his jaw worked with every lift, and she felt a swelling of admiration that transcended the fear. He was fighting for the town, for the winter, for the very survival of the life he had once tried to abandon. He was no longer hiding in his mill. He was actively, fiercely protecting the community he had kept at arm's length, and she was there with him. She was the one he trusted to share the burden. As the rain escalated into a torrential, blinding wall of gray, the darkness inside the mill deepened. The only light came from the occasional, brilliant flash of lightning that illuminated the churning river outside the open window, casting long, frantic shadows against the wooden walls. "One more trip," Thaddeus shouted over the roar of the wind, which now battered the building with the force of a physical blow. He was at the base of the loft ladder, his face pale with exertion, his hair plastered to his forehead. He reached out to take a sack from Matilda, but as he turned, a violent crack echoed through the mill, not of thunder, but of wood splintering under immense pressure. The entire mill shivered. A surge of muddy, freezing water erupted through the floorboards near the rear entrance, bubbling up like a dark, angry spring. The river had breached the lower walls. Thaddeus dropped the sack, his eyes widening as he assessed the rapid, gushing inflow. He rushed to the breach, his hands searching for something to jam into the gap, a piece of timber, a stone, anything to slow the surge. "Matilda," he yelled, his voice strained. "Get to the ladder. The floor is going to give." Matilda did not climb. She saw the way. The supports were beginning to bow under the sudden, violent weight of the water. She saw that Thaddeus was standing directly in the path of the worst of the inflow, his boots already ankle-deep in the freezing slush. She surged forward, ignoring the ladder, ignoring her own safety. She grabbed a massive, heavy iron pry bar from the wall, her muscles coiling as she swung it into the frame of the building, securing a support beam that had begun to buckle. She braced her own body against the timber, using her own considerable mass and strength to act as a living prop, holding the structure in place. "I have it," she shouted back, her voice ringing with a power she had never dared to use before. "You cannot hold that wall alone. Thaddeus. We have to secure the brace together." Thaddeus looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of shock and profound, undeniable love. He saw her, not as a burden, not as a giant to be hidden, but as the only person on earth who could stand beside him in this storm. He rushed to her side, his shoulder slamming against the timber, his massive frame locking with hers. They stood there, two giants braced against the fury of nature, their combined strength holding back the collapse. But the storm outside was only intensifying. The river was screaming now, a wall of water, rising higher and higher against the exterior walls of the mill. The floorboards beneath them groaned, the wood splintering further. They were trapped, and the water was rising, turning the mill into a hollow, fragile shell. Would their shared strength be enough to keep the building standing? Or were they about to be washed away by the very element they had tried to protect? The water was freezing, a numbing, suffocating presence that crept higher with every passing heartbeat. It swirled around their knees laden with silt and debris, tugging relentlessly at the foundation of the mill. Matilda felt the wood beneath her boots slick with the river's grime, and the timber beam she pressed her shoulder against felt like it was shifting, groaning in protest against the violent pressure of the rising flood. Thaddeus stood beside her, his massive frame vibrating with the strain. He did not look at her, his entire focus consumed by the immense downward force of the roof threatening to collapse. His face was a mask of grim determination, his dark beard matted with water, his eyes fixed on the structural point, where the main support beam had begun to buckle. "The foundation is failing," he shouted over the deafening roar of the river, his voice strained and raw. "We must jam the wedge," Matilda countered, her own voice ringing out with a fierce, unwavering clarity. She had spotted a large, thick piece of scrap timber nearby, floating in the swirling dark water near the workbench. They had only a heartbeat. If they let go of the beam, the ceiling would come down upon them, crushing the very life they had begun to build. If they stayed, they were risking everything. "I will reach for it," Thaddeus decided, his arm muscles bulging as he held the weight for both of them, his calloused hand locking onto her shoulder to hold her steady. "You keep the brace." "No," Matilda refused, her heels digging into the floorboards. She knew his strength was legendary, but she also knew the strain he was under. "We moved together." On three, they stood on the precipice of survival, two massive, resilient beings battling the fury of the mountain itself. They were no longer the outcasts, the giantess who felt too much, and the miller who had felt too little. They were a singular force, a pair of pillars holding up the world. "One," Thaddeus grunted, the timber bowing further. "Two," Matilda breathed, her gaze locking with his, a silent promise of absolute, unyielding support passing between them. "Three," they moved with the synchronized precision of predators. They lunged for the timber wedge, their bodies working in a blur of coordinated power. Matilda shoved the heavy beam into the gap, her shoulder slamming into the wood with the force of a battering ram. Thaddeus followed, his massive hands guiding the wedge into place, his weight driving it deep into the shifting structural joint. The sound of the wood seating was a sharp, final crack that echoed through the mill like a gunshot. The ceiling stopped its descent. The immediate danger of collapse was stayed, but the water continued to rise, claiming the floor, turning the sanctuary into a dark, swirling basin. They stepped back, gasping for air, their chests heaving in unison. They were soaked to the bone, their muscles screaming from the exertion, but they were standing. "We need to get to the loft," Thaddeus said, wiping the muddy water from his eyes. He looked at the window, where the river was now level with the sill. "The walls will not hold against this pressure for long." Matilda nodded, her heart pounding. She looked at the ladder, which was now partially submerged. It was their only path to safety, but the water was churning violently around it, creating a whirlpool that made the rungs appear treacherous. As they moved toward the ladder, a sudden, thunderous crash shook the entire building. The exterior wall, battered by a massive uprooted pine tree that the river had swept downstream, gave way. The force of the impact was absolute. The timber wall splintered, and a torrent of debris and black, freezing water rushed into the room, creating a chaotic, surging current that knocked them off their feet. Matilda felt herself swept away, the current dragging her toward the jagged remains of the wall. She thrashed, her powerful arms fighting the water, her instincts screaming for purchase. She grabbed a floating table, her knuckles white, her body straining against the relentless pull of the river. "Thaddeus," she screamed, her voice piercing the roar of the storm, was fighting the current, his large body struggling against the surge that threatened to carry him out into the night. He reached for her, his arm outstretched, his fingers brushing the fabric of her dress. He was strong, far stronger than any man she had ever known, but he was pinned against the remaining structural post by the debris. "I am here," he bellowed, his voice laced with an intensity that defied the terror of the moment. He lunged forward, ignoring the danger, ignoring the weight of the timber shifting above them. He grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. With a surge of strength that seemed to draw from the very bedrock of the mountain, he pulled her toward him, dragging her away from the breach in the wall. They scrambled to the center of the room, seeking the higher ground of the partially intact floorboards. The mill was dying, its bones breaking under the weight of the flood. Every timber groaned, every joint shrieked. The ladder, Thaddeus pointed toward the loft. It was still upright, though the water was swirling around its base. "Go, Matilda. You must climb." "I will not go without you," she cried, her eyes wide, with a fear that had nothing to do with the water and everything to do with the man beside her. Thaddeus looked at the ladder, then back at the structural beam they had wedged into place. He saw that the impact of the tree had loosened the wedge. If it fell, the loft, their only refuge, would collapse, sealing their fate. "I have to secure the wedge," he shouted, his eyes burning with a desperate, self-sacrificing resolve. "No," Matilda grabbed his arm, her massive, muscular hand digging into his wet shirt. "We climb together." Thaddeus shook his head, a ghost of a sad, tender smile touching his lips. He leaned forward, his forehead pressing against hers for a fleeting, agonizing second. "The loft will not hold both of us if the support fails," he whispered, his voice low, intimate, and final. "Climb, Matilda. I will follow." Before she could protest, a fresh surge of water, carrying a massive, heavy shelf of iron equipment, slammed into the back of the room. The force of the impact was devastating. The wooden floor beneath them buckled, and the very support beam they had braced snapped with a sickening, wet crunch. The floor collapsed. The room erupted in a spray of splintered wood and churning, dark water. Matilda felt the ground drop away beneath her. She grabbed the edge of the loft ladder, her arms straining as her entire weight hung suspended over the churning chaos below. She looked down, her heart stopping in her chest. Thaddeus was gone. He had been standing directly where the floor gave way, and now he was lost in the swirling darkness of the broken, submerged mill. The debris was shifting, the heavy timbers slamming together with a violent, rhythmic finality. She hung there, her muscles burning, her gaze scouring the black, frothing water for any sign of him. "Thaddeus," she shrieked, her voice echoing into the hollow, dying shell of the building. There was no answer. Only the roar of the river, the relentless pounding of the rain, and the sickening sound of the mill being dismantled, piece by piece, by the flood. She knew he was trapped. She knew he had been beneath the collapsing floor, perhaps pinned by the very timbers he had been trying to secure. She looked up at the loft, her path to safety, and then down at the destruction. To climb was to survive. To descend was to risk everything. She did not hesitate. She dropped from the ladder, her body hitting the icy, swirling water with a splash. She dove into the black, debris-filled depths, her hands sweeping through the mud, searching for the man who had taught her she was worthy of being protected. The current was a living thing, a hungry beast that tore at her clothes and battered her limbs. She fought it, her massive strength, the only thing keeping her from being washed out into the night. She dove deeper, past the submerged furniture, past the shifting floorboards, her fingers grazing cold, hard wood, and then something else. She felt a hand. A large, calloused, familiar hand, trapped beneath a heavy, submerged beam. It was motionless. The terror that seized her was sharper than the cold, a piercing, absolute dread that threatened to paralyze her. She gripped his hand, pulling with all her might, but he did not budge. He was caught fast. The water was rising, the air pocket in the mill shrinking by the second. She had to move him, she had to free him, or the very sanctuary they had built would become his grave. She braced her feet against a submerged support pillar and pulled, her muscles bulging, her veins standing out against her skin. She felt the beam shift just an inch, but it was not enough. Above her, the roof groaned, the structure giving one final, agonizing shudder. The end was coming, and she was trapped in the wreckage with the man she had finally allowed herself to love. Would her strength be enough to break the mountain of wood pinning him, or would they both be lost to the black water? The water was not merely cold. It was a living weight, a dark, suffocating shroud that pressed against every inch of Matilda's skin. She fought the urge to surface, to gasp for the air that felt miles away, and instead drove herself deeper into the churning ruin of the mill floor. Her fingers were locked around Thaddeus's wrist, and through the frantic, adrenaline-fueled pulse, she felt a terrifying, weakening flutter. He was losing consciousness. The air pocket beneath the submerged timbers was vanishing, and if she did not act with the absolute, raw power of her entire being, the mountain man would be claimed by the river. Matilda planted her feet against a submerged, waterlogged support post. She was a giant, a woman of immense, God-given physicality, and for her entire life, she had sought to suppress this strength. She had viewed her muscular thighs and broad, iron-strong shoulders as a deformity, a collection of traits that made her appear like a creature of burden rather than a woman of grace. But as she stared into the murky dark, seeing the man who had been her only true shield, that shame burned away. She did not need to be delicate. She did not need to be measured. She needed to be a force of nature. She surged upward, her massive, sculpted muscles engaging in a rhythmic, terrifying display of power. She grabbed the heavy, water-soaked timber pinning Thaddeus's legs. It was a beam of old-growth oak, waterlogged and weighted down by the shifting debris of the mill. It felt like an anchor. Matilda roared, a sound that vibrated through the water and drove her heels into the mud. She felt the fibers of her muscles stretch, the power building from the soles of her feet through her massive thighs into the core of her back and out through her arms. This was the strength she had spent years apologizing for. This was the strength that had hauled coal in the city, the strength that had been mocked as masculine and monstrous. She channeled all of it into the lift. The timber budged. She screamed, a wordless sound of defiance, and heaved with every ounce of her soul. The beam shifted a few inches. Then, with a groan of displaced water and grinding wood, it moved enough. Matilda did not wait for the beam to settle. She surged forward, her powerful arms wrapping around Thaddeus's chest. She felt the heavy, dead weight of him, a mountain of a man, reduced to a fragile, sinking stone. She kicked off the bottom, her legs driving them toward the surface like a torpedo. Her lungs were screaming for oxygen, the cold pressure of the water, turning her vision into a kaleidoscope of gray sparks. She breached the surface. The air, damp, freezing, and filled with the scent of rain, tasted like salvation. She gasped, a sound that tore at her throat, and dragged Thaddeus toward the base of the loft ladder. She did not stop. She hauled him onto the submerged floorboards, his body limp, his face a pale, ghostly mask in the flashes of lightning. She collapsed beside him, her entire body trembling with the aftershocks of the exertion. She crawled over to him, her hands pressing against his chest, feeling for a heartbeat. It was there, slow, irregular, but present. She leaned over him, her hair dripping into his face, and began the work of forcing the water from his lungs. She did not do it with the gentle touch of a lady. She did it with the firm, commanding hands of a woman who refused to let death have him. She pressed, she waited, she breathed, and she pressed again. "Come back," she whispered, her voice fierce and commanding. "You cannot leave me, Thaddeus. Not now. Do not you dare leave me." His chest shuddered. A violent, choking cough erupted from his throat, followed by a torrent of river water. He turned onto his side, his body racking with the effort, his eyes fluttering open to fix upon her face. He was alive. The light in his eyes was dim, unfocused, but it was there. He reached out, his thick, calloused hand finding her shoulder. He squeezed. A weak, trembling gesture of recognition. Matilda, he breathed. The name a jagged, fragile sound. She collapsed against him. Shoo. Her face buried in the crook of his neck, her ears mixing with the freezing rain that fell through the shredded roof of the mill. She did not care that they were broken, that they were shivering, that the world they had inhabited was being torn apart. She only knew that he was breathing. They lay there for what felt like an eternity, huddled together on the island of debris in the center of the surging river. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a wounded animal, but the mill remained. The loft, at least, was still standing, a silent, defiant witness to their survival. As the first faint gray of morning touched the sky, the intensity of the storm finally began to fade. The river's roar softened from a scream to a persistent, low rumble. The water within the mill stopped its violent churning and began a slow, sluggish retreat. Thaddeus sat up slowly, his body protesting every movement. He looked around the ruin of his home. The grinding stones were buried beneath a mountain of silt and splintered pine. The storage room, where they had worked the grain, was entirely washed away. The hearth, the very heart of the kitchen, where Matilda had performed her alchemy, the place where they had shared their first life-changing bread, was a pile of shattered rock and mud. The kitchen was gone. Thaddeus looked at the ruin, his face tight with the remnants of his exhaustion. He turned to Matilda, who sat beside him, watching the horizon with a gaze that had grown remarkably steady. She looked at the destruction, not with the terror of a woman who had lost her sanctuary, but with the quiet, reflective calm of a woman who had just realized that the sanctuary was not the structure. The sanctuary was the connection they had forged. Everything is lost, Thaddeus murmured, his gaze sweeping the wreckage of the floor, the missing walls, the ruined supplies. Matilda looked at the empty space where the oven had been. It was gone, washed into the river, leaving only a scar in the foundation. She felt a twinge of grief for the stone hearth she had loved, but it was fleeting. She looked at Thaddeus, at the rise and fall of his chest, at the steady, living warmth of his hand still resting on her arm. The work is not lost, she replied, her voice soft and resonant. The work is still here. Thaddeus stared at her, seeing the strength that had saved his life, the resolve that had defied the mountain, and the love that was now, finally, visible in the way she looked at him. He realized then that he had been so busy protecting his mill, so busy guarding his isolation, that he had failed to see the truth. The mill had never been his home. He was home. He had been home the moment she had reached for him in the water. He stood up, his legs shaking, and held out his hand to her. Matilda took it, her hand disappearing into his, their fingers interlocking with a strength that felt like an oath. They stood together in the ruins of the mill, two survivors amidst the wreckage, their clothes torn, their bodies battered, but their spirits unbroken. But as the sun crested the mountains, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the extent of the damage, Matilda felt a sudden cold shiver. She looked toward the town. The path was washed away. The bridge was gone. They were cut off, isolated from the very people who had been waiting for the bread, waiting for the promise of the harvest. She looked back at Thaddeus, her brow furrowing with a sudden dawning realization. The storm had passed, but what was waiting for them when the waters fully receded? Was the town still there, or had the mountain taken more than just the mill? He winced from the ache. The morning light crawled over the jagged peaks of the mountains like a cold, indifferent hand, illuminating the carnage the storm had left in its wake. Where the river had once murmured a gentle, rhythmic lullaby, it now roared with a muddy, churning fury, dragging the debris of the forest and the remnants of human life toward the valley floor. Matilda stood on the high ground, her massive, muscular frame shivering in the damp air, her eyes tracking the path of the destruction. The grist mill, which had been the anchor of her short, meaningful life in this valley, was no longer a structure. It was a skeleton. The walls had been stripped away by the sheer force of the current, leaving only a few jagged timber beams jutting upward like broken fingers. The stone oven, the magnificent, heavy-duty hearth that Thaddeus had labored over for 3 days, was gone. It had been pulled from the foundations, if it were nothing more than a child's toy, swallowed whole by the raging, relentless water. Matilda felt a hollow, aching void in her chest that was far colder than the damp morning wind. She walked down to the edge of the ruin, her boots sinking into the thick, treacherous slurry of mud and silt that covered everything. She picked her way over shattered floorboards and tangled, water-soaked rope. She found a single, scorched stone that had once been part of the oven's inner lining. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the rough surface, feeling the lingering grit of the work they had shared. The insecurity that she had fought to bury surged up, unbidden and sharp. She had believed for a few blissful weeks that she had finally transcended the label of the beast of burden. She had believed that her hands were made for something more than just hauling, lifting, and enduring. She had believed that she was a baker, a provider, a woman who could create beauty from the raw, unmeasured elements of the earth. But now, as she looked at the wreckage of her purpose, the old, cruel voice of the orphanage matron echoed in the silence of her mind. That voice told her that she was a creature of chaos, incapable of building anything that would endure. It told her that she was meant to move, to labor, and to break, but never to create. The kitchen was gone. The oven was gone. Without the tools and the space to ply her trade, she was just a giant woman standing in the mud. A cumbersome, hulking shadow of a person with no place to belong. She dropped the stone into the sludge. It made no sound as it disappeared, swallowed by the earth. She wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders hunched against the crushing weight of her own perceived insignificance. She was not a baker. She was not an artist. Thaddeus was nearby, his tall, broad-shouldered frame, moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation through the mud. He, too, was scouring the ruins, though his focus was different. He was not looking for what was lost. He was looking for what could be saved. His clothes were stained with the dark, pervasive silt of the river, and his hair was plastered to his head, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the ground with a rhythmic, intense focus. He paused near what had once been the pantry, the place where the sacks of grain had been kept. He dropped to his knees, his massive hands plunging into the muck, brushing aside debris, clearing away the tangle of sodden grain bags. He worked with a strange, quiet reverence, as if he were excavating a burial site for his own past. Matilda watched him from a distance, her heart heavy with the fear that his silent, relentless labor was futile. There was nothing left to save. The mill was dead. The life they had begun to build together had been erased in a single, violent night of rain. She turned away, intending to walk toward the town, toward the unknown, toward the place where she would surely have to return to a life of service that demanded nothing of her soul. Matilda. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, barely audible over the receding thunder of the river. She stopped. She did not want to turn around. She did not want to see the pity in his eyes, or worse, the resignation. She did not want to acknowledge that it was over. Matilda, he called again. Firmer this time. She turned, her movements sluggish, her spirit heavy with a deep, encroaching numbness. Thaddeus stood slowly, his legs braced in the mud. He looked at her, his face grim, his breathing ragged. He held something in his hand, a small, dark object that he had pulled from the sludge. He stepped toward her, his pace uneven. He was battered, his skin bruised from the struggle in the river, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving. He held out his hand, opening his thick, calloused palm. Resting there, coated in a layer of dried mud and tarnished, dark metal, was a small, heavy measuring cup. It was an old thing, its handle bent, its rim dented and worn from years of use. It looked entirely out of place in the devastation of the ruined mill. It was a tool of precision, a relic of the very world that Matilda had spent her life trying to escape. The world that had used such items to measure her worth and find her lacking. Matilda felt a cold, sharp spike of terror lance through her. The sight of the cup did not bring comfort. It brought a flood of memories she had kept locked away in the deepest, darkest chambers of her heart. She saw the kitchen of the orphanage. She saw the matron's face, tight and thin-lipped. She felt the heavy, wooden rod descending upon her knuckles, the stinging, biting pain of a correction for an overflow of flour, a cup that was not leveled, a measurement that failed to meet the rigid, unforgiving standards of the institution. She had learned to bake by feel, not just because she had a talent for it, but because she had been terrified of the tools. She had learned to use her hands because hands could not be weighed, could not be calibrated, and could not be found lacking by a metal scale. The cup was not just a tool. It was the symbol of her trauma. It was the witness to every failure, every punishment, every moment she had been told that she was a monster. She took a step backward, her breath hitching in her throat. She could not look at it. She could not breathe. The air in the valley suddenly felt thin, suffocating, as if the storm had returned to claim her, not with water, but with the suffocating weight of her past. Thaddeus took another step forward, his eyes locked onto her face. He saw the terror. He saw the way she recoiled, the way the light drained from her expression. He did not understand the history of the object, not yet, but he understood the violence of her reaction. He understood that he had unearthed something far more dangerous than broken timber or ruined grain. He looked down at the cup, then back at her, his expression shifting from one of grim discovery to a raw, aching protectiveness. He did not try to force it upon her. He did not offer it as a gift. He held it, suspended in the air between them, a silent bridge across the chasm of their shared suffering. "I found this in the pantry," Thaddeus murmured, his voice gentle, stripped of its usual, stoic reserve. It was buried deep in the mud. Matilda could not speak. Her hands trembled at her sides, her fingers clenching and unclenching. The world around her seemed to tilt, the horizon blurring as the memories crowded in. The shame, the pain, the overwhelming, crushing sense of being an unfixable, oversized mistake. She waited for him to comment on its presence, to remark on its utility, to suggest that they might use it to restart their work. She waited for him to become the voice of the world that measured her, the voice that demanded she be smaller, sharper, and more precise. But he did not. He stood in the mud, a giant of a man who had faced the mountain and the flood, waiting for her to find her voice. He did not know why she was trembling, but he knew that her pain was real, and that he was the only witness to it. What would happen when she finally spoke the truth? And would the man who had lost everything to the winter fever be able to understand the secret that had defined her entire, solitary life? Matilda stared at the tarnished metal, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She did not see a cup, she saw a ruler. She saw the iron gates of the orphanage, the cold, sterile light of the kitchen, and the faces of women who treated her existence as a mathematical error. She saw herself, a massive, oversized girl, with hands that were too large and shoulders that were too broad, trying to shrink into the space they had allotted for her. Every time she had reached for a vessel, she had felt the gaze of the matrons, sharp, critical, and waiting for the slightest mistake to justify their cruelty. "It is not a tool," Matilda whispered, her voice trembling, carrying the jagged edges of a lifetime of suppressed hurt. "It is a punishment." Thaddeus remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her face, his heart aching with a profound, sudden understanding. He had lived his life, believing his grief was a unique, mountainous weight. But he realized now that Matilda had carried a burden just as heavy, one crafted by those who were meant to care for her. He looked at the measuring cup in his hand, the dents, the worn edges, the cold, utilitarian metal, and he finally saw the history etched into its surface. "Tell me," Thaddeus commanded, not with authority, but with an invitation that opened the door to the deepest, most hidden part of her soul. Matilda looked at the ruins of the mill, her gaze unfocused. "They did not want me to be a baker. They wanted me to be a shadow. But I was always too large. I took up too much space. I was too strong. I was clumsy," they said. "I was a brute." She stepped forward, her movement stiff, as if she were walking through deep water. "Whenever I failed to measure perfectly, whenever the flour spilled over the rim or the water was not exact, they used this. They would hold it up to me, and they would measure my failure against the perfection of the other girls. They would press the edge of it into my skin, marking where I fell short. I did not learn to bake because I loved the craft. I learned to bake because it was the only way to earn my keep, to ensure I would not be cast out. I learned to use my hands because they could not measure my hands. My hands were my own. They could not mark my skin if I did not let them hold the tools. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of terror and liberation. I did not come here to bake for the town. I came here to find a place where the measurements did not matter. I came here to find a place where I was enough, just as I was. The silence in the aftermath of her confession was profound. The mountain, the river, the sky, all seemed to hold their breath. Thaddeus looked down at the measuring cup, the object that had terrorized a child and haunted a woman. He felt a surge of visceral, protective rage, not toward the world in general, but toward the specific, petty cruelty of people who could not see the value of a human heart. He did not place the cup back in her hands. He did not ask her to keep it. He tightened his fist. The metal groaned. Thaddeus was a man of the mountain, his grip forged by years of hauling timber and processing iron-hard grain. His hands were capable of crushing stone. He flexed his fingers, the leather of his gloves creaking as he applied the full, relentless force of his will. The measuring cup, a relic of a lifetime of shame, began to warp. The rim buckled, the base collapsed, and the metal shrieked as it was forced to yield. He twisted his wrist, his muscles coiling with a savage, righteous intensity, until the cup was nothing more than a twisted, unrecognizable ball of scrap. He opened his hand and let the mangled lump of metal fall into the mud. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, instantly swallowed by the mire. Matilda watched these objects vanish, and for the first time in her life, the crushing weight in her chest began to dissolve. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping, the years of held tension finally releasing. She was not the girl in the orphanage. She was not the runaway on the stagecoach. She was a woman who had stood against the mountain, who had saved a life, and who had finally truly been seen. Thaddeus stepped toward her, his movements no longer cautious. He reached out and took her face in his hands, his touch warm, steady, and utterly reverent. He wiped a smudge of river mud from her cheek with his thumb, his gaze holding hers with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. "You are not a mistake," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vow. "You are not a measurement. You are the heartbeat of this place." Matilda leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as the warmth of his presence flooded through her. She felt the tears slip from her eyes, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of baptism, washing away the last of the fear. She reached up and placed her hands over his, the contact grounding her, anchoring her to the man who had become her sanctuary. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice clear, no longer trembling. "The mill is gone. The town is cut off. We have nothing left." Thaddeus looked toward the horizon, where the storm clouds were breaking, revealing the first brilliant shards of sunlight. He looked at the valley below, at the scattered debris of the flood, and then back at Matilda. "We have everything," he stated. They stood together in the ruins, the wreckage of their past life scattered around them. But the path forward was no longer obscured by the shadows of their secrets. They were stripped from the they were stripped bare and completely exposed to the elements, yet they felt more secure than they had ever been in the safety of the mill. As they stood, watching the morning sky, they heard a sound in the distance. It was not the roar of the river, nor the whistle of the wind. It was the low, rhythmic clatter of wagon wheels on gravel and the murmur of voices, a small, dedicated caravan emerging from the trail that led down from the mountain ridge. Matilda squinted, her heart jumping as she recognized the figures. It was the magistrate, Martha, leading a group of men and women from the town. They were carrying tools, shovels, hammers, coils of rope, and baskets of food. They were not coming to investigate, and they were not coming to measure. They were coming to dig. "Look," Matilda breathed, her hand tightening on Thaddeus's arm. Thaddeus watched as the townspeople descended the slope, their faces etched with a solemn, focused purpose. They were not looking at the destruction. They were looking at the survivors. They were coming to offer their labor, their presence, and their support to the two people who had, in their own way, saved the valley from the starvation of the coming winter. The realization hit Matilda with the force of a physical blow. She had spent her life believing that she had to do everything alone, that she had to be the mountain, that she had to be the labor, and that she had to be the measure. She had never known that it was possible to be part of something larger than herself. She had never known that she could be helped. As the villagers approached, she felt a strange, terrifying, and wonderful question bloom in her mind. They were coming to rebuild, but what would they rebuild? Would they simply try to restore the old mill, or were they about to create something entirely new from the ruins? The valley was no longer a place of isolated mourning or quiet, desperate survival. The arrival of the townspeople changed the very frequency of the air. Where there had once been the solitary, rhythmic thud of a miller's labor, there was now a symphony of construction. The ring of hammers against stone, the groan of timber being hauled into place, and the low, companionable hum of voices that had once been distant, now brought close by the shared necessity of the harvest. Martha, the magistrate who had once demanded ledgers and scales, moved through the mud with a shovel in her hand, her expression one of quiet, determined industry. She did not ask for measurements. She did not demand a standard. She simply worked, her gaze meeting Matilda's with a newfound silent respect. The merchant, who had once rushed into the kitchen to snatch a loaf of bread, was now hauling heavy stone slabs, his face streaked with dirt, and his movements fueled by the same purpose that drove the miller. They were not rebuilding the mill exactly as it had been. They were building something wider, something sturdier, something that belonged to everyone. Matilda worked alongside them, her towering frame a testament to resilience. She did not feel the need to hide her strength, nor did she feel the need to apologize for her size. She moved the heavy timbers with a fluid, powerful grace that left the men standing nearby in hushed awe. But there was no mockery in their eyes now. There was only admiration. They understood that the strength she possessed was the same strength that had saved the town's winter stores and kept the miller from being lost to the river. Thaddeus stood at the center of it all, his presence a guiding force. He did not issue orders. He simply worked, his massive hands setting the foundation for the new hearth. He had designed this one differently. It was grander, more open, a communal heart that would serve not just the mill, but the town. When the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting a warm, amber glow across the construction site, the frame of the new hearth stood tall and proud. Matilda approached Thaddeus, her hands dusted with the same clay he used to bind the stones. She looked at the work, then back at the man who had stood beside her when the world had tried to wash them away. "They are not asking for a recipe," Matilda murmured, watching the women of the town bring baskets of food to the workers, sharing a meal that required no scales to prove its goodness. Thaddeus turned to her, his sharp, observant eyes softening with a warmth that seemed to have no end. "They are not looking for a measurement, Matilda. They are looking for the heart." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The touch was firm, grounding, and absolute. There was no hesitation now, no ghost of his past pulling him away. He was fully present, fully committed, and fully hers. "You once asked me why I stayed in the dark," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying clearly over the soft sounds of the evening. "I stayed because I thought the world was a ledger, and that I had already spent everything I had to give. I thought that loss was the only thing that could be accurately measured." He looked at her, his expression a testament to the life that had been restored. "I was wrong. Love is not a debt to be tallied. Is a harvest to be shared." Matilda felt the tears prick at her eyes, but she did not look away. She thought of the measuring cup, mangled and buried in the mud, a relic of a life that had tried to define her by her shortcomings. She thought of the hands that had been accused of clumsiness, the hands that had been punished for their size. She looked at those same hands now, resting securely in the hands of the man who saw them as a gift. "My grandmother never needed measuring cups," she whispered, the realization finally settling deep into her bones, where it would stay forever. She knew that you cannot quantify the taste of a memory, and you cannot weigh the comfort of a home. You simply have to be there, fully present, letting the work be enough. The evening deepened into a soft velvet indigo, and the stars began to blink into existence above the mountains. The townspeople eventually departed, leaving the valley to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the night. The mill was still a skeleton, the hearth still a work in progress, but the silence did not feel empty. It felt expectant. It felt like the beginning of a story that would be told for generations. The fire that Thaddeus had lit at the edge of the ruin threw long, dancing shadows against the broken timbers, a small beacon of light in the vast, quiet valley. They sat together on a pile of salvaged lumber, their shoulders brushing, their bodies weary but content. There was no need for words. The work they had done, the lives they had reclaimed, and the future they were beginning to build were all contained in the simple, steady proximity of their presence. They had learned that the most profound truths of the human heart are rarely the ones that can be quantified. Like the rising of the dough or the deepening of affection, the most vital things in life require patience, intuition, and the courage to trust the process without knowing the exact outcome. They had spent years trying to measure their worth against the standards of a world that thrived on scarcity and competition, only to discover that true abundance is found in the willingness to give without keeping count. In the end, it was not the perfection of the bread or the precision of the architecture that anchored them to the valley. It was the messy, unpredictable, and beautiful reality of being known. It was the realization that while the storm had taken their walls, it had cleared the path for them to see each other clearly. The sanctuary they had sought was not a place to be protected from the elements. It was the ability to stand together in the open air, weathering whatever came with a trust that no storm could touch. They had found their place not by fitting into the molds they had been given, but by having the courage to break them and build something entirely their own, measured only by the depth of their devotion and the warmth of the hearth they would keep lit together for the rest of their days. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products. Normally I can help with things like this, but I don't seem to have access to that content. You can try again or ask me for something else.